So bonjour à toutes et à tous. مرحبا يا أصدقاء من ولاية Indiana. I will be speaking in English to add another language. Hopefully the translation will be helpful and hopefully my ideas will be clear. This is a very simple lecture on the question of salvation of the other. I'm very sorry not to be with you in Beirut. For personal reasons, I would like to thank Michel and Raphael and Antoine and the whole group who has worked for years on the preparation of this conference. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we'll begin. Okay, hopefully that's clear. Can someone confirm you can see my screen? Okay. Vous voyez l'écran partagé? Okay, I'm taking that as a yes, and I'll proceed. So, friends, the topic is Islam and the salvation. Islam and the salvation of non-Muslims, the Quranic perspective. I will speak on a couple of topics along the way, including the relationship generally between God and humanity in the Quran. I'll speak about the question of sin, dhanb, khati'ah. There are many words for it in the Quran. I'll speak on the signs or ayat in nature, and then prophecy as a mercy. I'll speak about divine vengeance, divine freedom. And finally, I'd like to focus on a verse from Surah Al-Isra, which I think has a special relevance for the question of the salvation of non-Muslims. So hopefully that sounds interesting, and I'll proceed. I'm timing myself for about 35 minutes. I hope that sounds okay. Someone can contradict me if that's wrong. Okay, excellent, merci. Okay, so let's begin with the God-human relationship in the Quran. I mean, I think an important basic premise or principle to begin is to say that I'm reading the Quran as literature, as a text, but I'm interested in the Quran's own theological ideas. So I'm not engaging principally with kalam or aqidah or fiqh, usul al-fiqh on these questions, but principally the Quran as a work of literature. And we can speak and debate about that, whether that's legitimate. I'd be happy to speak about that in the debate. I'd like to bring to your attention three works from the West, more or less, which are influential in my thinking. The first is the work of the Japanese scholar, so I say the West, but he's Japanese, Toshihiko IZUTSU in 1964, God and Man in the Quran. The next is a work of Johann Buhmann in German with the same title, but in German, Gott und Mensch in Quran, that's from 1977. And then the third is someone known to many of us, the Dominican Jacques Chaumier, who wrote a third book also with the same title, but in French, Dieu et l'homme dans le Coran, and that was in 1996. So these are all interesting discussions with a similar approach, Quran as literature. What is the relationship between God and humanity? I start with an idea of IZUTSU, who is very clear in speaking about some of the Quran's ideas. He speaks of the relationship between God and humanity along two axes, or in two different ways. First is God as Lord, excuse me, and humans as servant. And he speaks about God with his majesty, sovereignty, absolute power, and then humanity with the necessary qualities as abd, including humbleness, modesty, obedience, which is contrasted with all of the values of Jahiliyyah. We heard about Jahiliyyah about the Muslim brothers. So here in the Quran, Jahiliyyah is signified like Hamiyat Jahiliyyah, if you think of that expression, with haughtiness, arrogance, self-sufficiency. And then he speaks about the ethical relation, so not simply the sovereignty of God, but his qualities, namely the mercy, goodness, and forgiveness of God, but also the wrath, severe, strict justice. And then humans, on the one hand, relate to the goodness of God with shukr, or gratitude, and on the other hand, relate to the severeness or severity of God with taqwa, this God-fearing, protective instinct. And it's interesting to note that shukr and taqwa can be contrasted both to the one Arabic word kufr, which includes within it both the sense of unthankfulness or ingratitude and the sense of disbelief. So this is sort of a basic beginning. Now, it's interesting to note that if the Quran lays out the possibility of shukr, of gratitude, the stories it tells of past prophets suggest, in fact, that most people act with ingratitude. And so we have the stories, for example, in Surah Al-A'raf, in Surah Hud, in Surah Al-Shu'ara, Surah Al-Qamar, many other surahs which speak about the so-called punishment stories, where in fact most people choose not to believe. I thought this verse from Surah Yunus is interesting, which speaks of just one people, the people of Jonah, whose belief benefited it. Of course, if you look at the end of the verse, it says, وَمَتَعْنَاهُمْ إِلَى حِينٍ, which suggests that even they were only granted a temporary respite for their belief. In fact, they too will be punished. For those of you who are interested in Quran and Bible, you may know that there is a biblical book named Nahum, which speaks about the eventual destruction of Nineveh, the people of Jonah. So we have this, what could be called this repeating scenario of God's customary way. If you look at the bottom of the screen, you see a quotation from Devin Stewart, who speaks about Sunnat Allah, of the way that God deals with recalcitrant unbelievers, which is annihilation, istisal, or halak, after a suitable delay and ample opportunity to heed the warning of prophets. Okay, on to the next topic of sin in the Quran generally. I mean, the basic point I want to make is the Quran seems to make general statements about humanity and their sinfulness. I just drew here 3 verses from Surah Yasin, which speak about the ways in which humans are always yasta'zi'un, mocking the messengers. We're always mu'rideen, always turning away from messengers rather, or the signs of God. And then in verse 77, we read about humanity as a khasim, and the Mufassirun disagree about what exactly khasim means here. But we do have the general sense from Surah Yasin in these passages, which I think are representative of a larger motif in the Quran, of humanity inclining towards evil, inclining towards sin. So why is it that the Quran has this, what we might call pessimistic anthropology? And this is where we might notice the comments of Nikolai Sinai in his excellent book, A Historical Critical Introduction to the Quran, who speaks about a nexus between eschatological denial and sinful behavior. So the denial of the reality of the resurrection and the sinful behavior which is consequent of those who are not, in fact, in fear of God. And all of this is anchored or connected to a highly pessimistic anthropology. So what explains this? What explains this pessimistic anthropology? Well, the Quran seems to give a couple of passages which speak about humanity as being hasty. So this is one quality of the pessimistic anthropology. By the way, interesting to note that here we don't see a distinction between different firaq or different religious communities. These are general statements about humans' nature. So here we have Surah Al-Anbiya about humans being created from hastily, again, Surah Al-Isra. And then we have this reference in Al-Adiyat of man being ungrateful to his Lord. Different versions of this word for ungrateful appear, kafur, kafar. Interesting to note that we begin to come to an answer about the pessimistic anthropology in Surah Al-Imran with this very interesting verb, zuyyana, here used in the passive. Here I follow the translation of Arthur Arbery. Decked out fair to men is the love of lusts, women, children, heaped up heaps of gold and silver, etc., etc. Zuyyana linnas hubba shahawat. Yeah. Now, the verse doesn't explain who is responsible for this tezyin. It puts it in the passive, but it suggests that somehow humans have woven into the very fabric, hub al-shahawat. Okay? Now, the Quran says, well, it's not God that's responsible. God is not responsible for the sinful instincts in humans. Here we have in Surah Yunus this affirmation that God does not wrong humans in anything, but they wrong their own selves and fusahum. Now, we do have a sense in this passage from Surah Al-An'am of who is responsible for the tazyin. If it's not God, then it's a shaitan. So here we read about the hearts of the unbelievers being hard. قَصَّتْ قُلُوبُهُمْ وَزَيَّنَ اللَّهُمَّ الشَّيْطَانَ مَا كَانُوا يَعْمَلُونَ. And if we reflect on the nature of this tazyin, it suggests that Satan is making the evil deeds that they're doing, or the unbelief which they hold, seem that to them to be right belief or to be good behavior. Yeah, so this adornment, this decking out fair, is what allows people to remain in their sinfulness. Here we have another passage where we have this verb again, zayyana, and there we see that the associates, which seems to be an allusion to the false gods, the associates of the mushrikun, they are the ones who zayyana, and they lead them to specific actions, slaying their children. They confuse their religion. Now, notice the last bit here, which is important. Had God willed, they would not have done so. So leave them to their forging. So now things get complicated theologically. Yeah, وَلَوْ شَاءَ اللَّهُ مَا فَعَلُوهُ. So that is, God himself, we might say, in his permissive will, allows for the effects of the tazyin of the false gods or of Satan. Okay, this is an important principle, which I'll speak about as divine freedom, that we'll return to. And things get more complicated when we look at Surah An-Naml in this passage, where we see that God himself, in certain passages, is said to be responsible for tazyin. So here we have what زَيَّنَّا لَهُمْ عَمَالَهُمْ فَهُمْ يَعْمَهُونَ. Okay, so here for the unbelievers, though not for the believers, God himself seems to be responsible for tazyin. So there's a lot to think about, a lot to consider in the Quranic description of human, the pessimistic anthropology of humans, and who is responsible for the leading astray of humans. Shaitan, shayateen, and in Surah An-Naml, even God can be responsible for leading people astray. Okay, just to complicate things further, I bring up a famous passage from Surah Yusuf, which speaks about something within the humans themselves, which leads them to sin. So we have now at least three possibilities to explain human sin. One is a shayateen, or the associates, the false gods. Another is God himself. And then a third is humanity. Humans have within them an element sometimes called the carnal soul, in Arabic, the NAFS, which is described in this story. Some of you might know the account where the wife of Al-Aziz, or in the biblical tradition, the wife of Potiphar, seeks to seduce Joseph into fornication, and he, of course, refuses. And at a certain point, she confesses, and she says, "Yet I claim not that my soul was innocent." A nice translation from Arbery. "Wama ubarri'u nafsi." I do not claim that my nafs was innocent. And she blames, in fact, this part of herself, which is the nafs. And in the next phrase, she says, "Inna an-nafsa la'amaratun bis-su." The nafs, this element of the human, commands one towards evil. Now, Arbery translates incites to evil. I collected here a number of different translations of this phrase. which might be interesting. Some of them suggest that the human soul indeed commands evil. I mean, that seems to be the simple rendition of the Arabic root. So we can see in Sahih International that the soul enjoins evil, again, enjoineth. Yusuf Ali is a bit more careful. He says the soul is prone to evil. Shakir is similar, is wont to commit evil. Sarwat is even more careful. He says is susceptible to evil. Musin Khan, inclined to evil, and Arbery we've seen incites to evil. So there's a real difference among the translators as to whether the human soul itself prompts one to evil, or rather humans are, the soul is receptive or inclined towards evil. I've written an article which may be a little shocking to some about original sin and the Quran, which you can find on my academia page. Don't argue that the Quran teaches original sin, but I argue that the two doctrines of sin are closer than is usually thought. Okay, wonderful. So on to the question of signs in nature and prophecy as mercy. The basic point is that God responds to human sinfulness and ingratitude with guidance. So God is not required by justice to send prophets in my reading of the Quran's own understanding. This is, of course, Mu'tazila, Ash'ariyya will dispute this point, but in my reading of the Quran, God is not required to send prophets, but he does so out of mercy. This is the language that's used for the sending of prophets. Now, the first point is that God already has woven into the fabric of creation signs which point to his existence, his power, and even more than that, signs which point to the reality of the resurrection of the body. So here we see in Surah Al-Mu'minun, so first, a description of the signs in nature, which include not only things like rain in the mountains and the development of an infant in the womb, but also the human faculties of hearing, of seeing, and hearts, which probably is associated with thinking. So it mentions all of this, and then they reject these signs, the unbelievers. What? When we are dead and become dust and bones, shall we indeed be raised up? Again, another passage from Surah Rum, which speaks about creation being brought back again a sign to the reality of the resurrection. The natural order points to the resurrection of the body, the way that land dies and then comes back to life. And once again, they deny, verse 29, nay, but the evildoers follow their own caprices without knowledge. Who shall guide those whom God has led astray? Okay, keep that phrase in mind. We'll return to it. Again, God can be responsible for tazyin, and God can be responsible for tadlil, or leading astray. Interesting to find this very provocative statement in Quran 80, verse 17. Perish man, how unthankful is he? This Arabic here is akfarahu, again, related to the root, which has to do with both ingratitude and unbelief. I think there may be both meanings implied here. Again, we have the reference to the natural signs. And the point is that despite the natural signs of creation, of the way that the rain causes the earth to bear fruit, which is good to humans, an enjoyment for you and your flocks, verse 32. And this is what will inspire divine vengeance, etc., etc. Okay, well, the point for the Quran is that humans have disbelieved, and God has not given up on them, but has sent messenger after messenger to them. And this is seen in a number of passages relating to the Prophet Muhammad himself, Surah Al-Baqarah, where Abraham and Ishmael pray to God to send a messenger among their descendants. and that this messenger will show them signs, teach them the book and the wisdom. Interesting question about what the hikmah is exactly. But it's interesting too that he's also said to purify them, tazkiyah. Again, in verse 151 of the same surah, God himself declares, we have sent yourselves a messenger to recite our signs and again to purify you. Surah Al-Imran, verse 164. Truly God was gracious to the believers when he raised up among them a messenger from themselves to recite to them his signs and to purify them. Now, remember, the signs of God are already given in nature, in the rain, in the human faculties. And so this is superabundant mercy, the sending of messengers who recites to them the signs. And there's a play there on ayat. Signs are both signs in nature and signs of divine revelation or divine books. All of this is mercy. And then again in Surah Al-Jumu'ah, verse 2, هُوَ الَّذِي بَعَثَ فِي الْأُمِّيِّينَ رَسُولًا مِّنْهُمْ. He is the one who sent among the common people a messenger from them to recite his signs and to purify them and to teach them the book and the wisdom. Okay, so in the system of the Quran, of the unfolding or the unveiling of divine grace and beneficence, the steps are first, natural signs, second, human ingratitude and stubbornness, and third, the superabundant grace or mercy in the sending of prophets. Okay, if this general system is the heart of the matter of the God-human relationship, the Quran also insists on divine freedom. And this is important to keep in mind with the Quran. God is free to lead astray as he is free to guide. So if he chose to give superabundant mercy, he can also do things like seal hearts. As you may know, there are many references to the sealing of hearts in the Quran. For example, when speaking about the Israelites in Surah An-Nisa, there's a reference to God sealing their hearts so only a few of them believe. I just presented on the PowerPoint here a reference near the beginning of Surah Al-Baqarah, where we see, as for the faithless, it is the same to them whether you warn them or do not warn them, they will not have faith. God has set a seal on their hearts, in their hearing, and a blindfold on their sight, and there is a great punishment for them. Okay, this is an important motif in the Quran. Taba is usually the verb that's used for the sealing of hearts. There are different interpretations among this. I said I wouldn't engage much with tafsir, but I just wanted to mention the Mu'tazili meaning Mufassir Zamakhshari, along with others, even in the Ash'ari tradition like Fakhruddin al-Razi, have concerns about the literal meaning of sealing of hearts that is more prominent in the Hanbali tradition. And so he gives these alternatives, saying sealing may only be an innate disposition of unbelief. So sealing here, whether it's khatama or taba, actually refers to the human condition of their own hearts. Remember, before we saw qassat qulubahum, their hearts were hard, so it was similar. It would be similar to that. Or he says perhaps sealing is used figuratively. Perhaps it is like how people say the mountain torrent has flown away with someone when a person has died, or a bird has flown away with someone when they're gone, but it's not literally a bird or not literally a mountain torrent. And then we see the option that it is Satan or the kuffar who themselves have sealed their hearts, since God gave them ability to do anything. This would be closer to what theologians would call God's permissive will, God allowing Satan or unbelievers to go astray of their own accord. Okay, but divine freedom also has to do with the question of forgiveness. And I wanted to bring forth a passage from Surah Al-Ma'idah, which emphasized God's ability to forgive and not forgive. This, of course, bringing us closer to the promised title of this talk, which is whether unbelievers can be forgiven and saved according to the Quran. Here we have this very interesting passage. it would be maybe too complicated to describe the context, but this is at the end of Surah Al-Ma'idah. It's come right after the miracle which God has provided to the Hawariyun of the table or Ma'idah that comes from heaven. Most interpreters argue that the conversation between God and Jesus takes place either immediately after Jesus's ascension into heaven or at the time of the day of judgment. We can sort of set that aside and just focus on the words here of God introduced by the Quran. وَإِذْ قَالَ اللَّهُ يَا عِيسَى ابْنَ مَرْيَمَ أَنْتَ قُلْتَ لِلنَّاسِ يَتَّخِذُونِي وَأُمِّيَ إِلَٰهَيْنِ مِن دُونَ اللَّهِ. O Jesus, son of Mary, did you say to humans, worship me and my mother as gods instead of Allah, instead of God? So he sort of interrogates Jesus, and the suggestion is, are you responsible for the unbelief, or rather the misbelief of Christians? And Jesus will say, glory to you, never could I say what I had no right to say. So he absolves himself of responsibility. Subhanaka ma yakunu li an aqula ma laysa li bil haqq. Had I said such a thing, you would indeed have known it. In verse 117, Jesus goes on and says exactly what he did do. He says, I was a witness among them. I only said to them, worship God, my God, and your God. And when you tuwafaytani, we will leave that phrase aside for now, took me or made me die, then you were responsible for them. So, but I want to skip verse 117 and go right to verse 118, where Jesus finally acknowledges divine freedom. Yeah, so Jesus says, "In tu'adhibhum fa innahum ibaduka." If you want to punish them, they are your servants. Remembering IZUTSU, what he says about humans as abd. And if you seek to forgive them, then you are the powerful and the wise. Okay, so this affirmation that God can forgive whom he wills. It seems to me that this verse, which, if you follow the chronology of the Quran, would be one of the last surahs, if not the last surah, revealed or proclaimed, is a clear affirmation of the possibility, though not the promise, that God can forgive non-Muslims and Christians in particular. Again, we can debate this afterwards. I would be happy to do so. Okay. This sense of, let's call it agnosticism in regard to the fate of non-Muslims is seen in a few, I don't mean agnosticism in the sense of belief in God or not, but in the fate of non-Muslims, this agnostic disposition of the Quran is seen in some other verses. For example, in Al-An'am verse 12, God has made mercy binding for himself. So this very famous phrase where God literally writes for himself mercy, but then immediately there's an allusion to the possible punishment of unbelievers. Those who have ruined their souls will not have faith. Again, in more maybe dramatic or paradoxical, Surah Al-A'raf, verse 156, I visit my punishment on whomever I wish. Adabi usibu bihi man asha, I think is the Arabic, but my mercy embraces all things. Wasiat is the Arabic verb there, my mercy embraces. So this dual affirmation that God can punish whomever he wishes, but also that his mercy embraces all things. Okay, and again, it suggests what we could call agnosticism. The salvation of non-Muslims is possible, but not promised. Daud Rahbar, the Pakistani scholar, says prophets do not offer philosophy. They offer wisdom of a type, a wisdom which has a dominant note. Okay, 2 more slides. I think I'm at 27 minutes, so I should finish in about 8 minutes. I hope that sounds okay. Okay, first, I'd just like to comment on whether, again, I said I wouldn't do too much on reception, but on whether we could learn something from Muhammad Ahmad Khalafallah, the controversial author of the narrative art of the Quran. I mean, for me, it's not very controversial, but for Al-Azhar at the time, of course, he was a student of Amin Khuli, many of you will know. So his work, The Narrative Art of the Quran, in which he makes a distinction between mantiq al-atifa, emotional logic, and mantiq al-nadr al-aqli, the intellectual theological logic, or rationalizing theological logic. Okay, and he says the Quran often operates with mantiq al-atifa, with this emotive or emotional logic. And he notes, just to give one example of his arguments, that when the Quran in Surah Al-Qamar describes the punishment of the people of Had, it doesn't give details, systematic details about the mission of Hud, the time and exact happenings when he preached. It doesn't describe the people of Ad, what were their jobs, what were they doing when Hud came along. It doesn't give them any names. But what it does describe in a terrifying way is the nature of the divine punishment. We unleashed upon them an icy gale on an incessantly ill-fated day, knocking down people as if they were trunks of uprooted palm trees. So he wants to say that the Quran means to do something like takhweef, inculcate fear of divine judgment, which itself is an act of mercy because it can save you from that judgment. By the way, I just wanted to point out, friends, on the right side, the image that you see here is part of a very interesting work of art that I like to show my students at the University of Notre Dame by an American artist named Sandow Burke. It's called The American Qur'an. He has taken a translation of the Quran and written it out completely by hand, and then illuminated that manuscript with scenes from American life. And the idea is the Quran should not seem to Americans always to be some foreign Arabian thing, but can have lessons for American life. So this is a scene from a hurricane that would take place in the southeastern America, a place like Florida or Louisiana, and is relevant for the passage spoken about here. Okay, finally, let's get on to this passage from Surah Al-Isra, this very important passage that I'd like to speak about by way of conclusion, verse 15. And the key phrase I would like to focus on is the end of the verse, وَمَا كُنَّا مُعَذَّبِينَ حَتَّى نَبْعَثَ رَسُولًا, which is something like, we never chastise or punish until we send forth a messenger. Okay, so this sort of brings together the first part of the talk, which speaks about prophethood and prophecy as a mercy, and the second part of the talk, which speaks about divine freedom. Okay, so there is something systematic, according to Surah Al-Isra, that there is sunnat Allah, or the customary way in which God deals with humans, and namely that a messenger is always sent before God finally delivers punishment upon a people. I wanted to look at a couple of passages from two different interpreters on how they take this, which show that it's not only Gabriel Said Reynolds who argues that the Quran is possibly open to the salvation of non-Muslims, but also some very important Muslim theologians. Okay, first point is that this verse follows from the logic of prophecy as mercy or guidance. I wanted to start with Ghazali in his Faisal al-Tafriqa Bain al-Islam wa Zandiqa. Here, Ghazali speaks of three different sorts of Christians. He's speaking about Christians in particular, although I think this is relevant for all non-Muslims. He says there are those who have never heard the truth. They can be saved. And then we'll skip to number 3. There are those who have only heard lies about Muhammad. They too can be saved. And then in between them are those who have heard the truth and consciously, willfully denied it. These are the kuffar muhidun. These are the godless unbelievers. Okay, and this is why in another passage, and I've just given you the Arabic here, we read, so I start here from the end of the line here. Inna akthar nasara rum wa turk fi hadha zaman tashmalahum rahma inshallah ta'ala ani alladhina hum fi aqasi rum wa turk wa lam tablaghuhum ad-da'wa. Okay, so most of the Christians of the Byzantines and the Turks in this day will be encompassed by divine mercy if God wills. I mean those in the furthest lands of the Byzantines and the Turks who have not, or whom the dawah, the call to Islam, has not reached. Okay, so he's potentially open to the salvation of Christians. He does has his conditions. Listen, this is not universalism. This is not an argument that everyone shall be saved. It's not fana anar, as the controversial treatise of Ibn Taymiyyah puts it. It's only the possibility of certain Christians being saved, but the possibility is there. Okay, and then another, looking at the Shiite Iranian scholar Tabatabai, moving forward about 8 or 9 centuries, commenting on this verse, he says that this means that God will not punish people with the punishment of annihilation, except after sending a messenger through them. He will always, in his mercy and kindness, communicate an exhortation and establish proof after proof. So he emphasizes divine mercy, Tabatabai, very strongly. But I'd also note that he goes on to say that what is expected for those who do not, in fact, receive a message from a prophet or shar'iyat, what is expected from aqaliyat, from intellectual deduction, is only belief in God. So those who have not, in fact, received a message will not be held accountable for the shar'iyat, for that is the teachings that are given through divine revelation. They'll be responsible only for belief in God. Okay, very interesting. So again, openness to salvation. Okay, so thank you very much for your patience with me. I think I'm basically at 35 minutes. I'll end with a self-promotion. I hope you don't mind. Very quickly, you see the book there. I also wanted to point out, which might be interesting for this group, these videos on Jesus and Islam and Christianity done by the Oasis Foundation and Martino Diaz, also with a group at the University of Notre Dame. That might be food for further thought as you continue your discussions. Thank you so much.